Ooh, let's talk about the bird of paradise. The orange bird of paradise, to be a little bit more precise, which is Strelitzia Reginae. There's also a larger bird of paradise, a much larger bird of paradise called the Strelitzia Reginae, which has white flowers. And just as a disclaimer, my Latin, terrible, so I will write those out on the screen. For today, focusing primarily on the Strelitzia Reginae, also known as the red or orange bird of paradise. This is the more sought after as far as like floral type plants go, because the white bird of paradise flower really isn't all that impressive. The white bird of paradise is grown mostly for its foliage, whereas the orange bird of paradise is grown for its foliage and especially for its flowers. These guys are native to South Africa, and they're fully hardy zones 9 and up. But I have heard of people growing them in warmer parts of zone 8 with some success. So there is possibility there. For all the rest of us who have to grow these guys in pots, there's some tips and tricks to getting these guys to flower, because it's not always that simple to do when they're not in the ground. And even when they're in the ground, it's not always that easy to get them to flower. You have to have them planted right. If you want to grow these guys in a pot, go ahead and try and keep them in their nursery pot as long as you can, because once you transplant these guys, you can offset your blooming by a year or two. These plants really do like to be root bound. Not always to a point where they're necessarily exploding out of the sides of their pots, but I have had some in the past where they were blowing out of the sides of their pots and they were growing wonderfully. And I didn't realize it because I had them potted in their pots inside of another pot to keep those roots nice and tight, but I wanted them in something more decorative. So that's a good option for you to keep them nice and root bound, but you want them in a larger, more decorative pot. Just keep them in their nursery pot or whatever pot it is that they came in, and dig a hole out and put it in that pot. Now this isn't quite fitting. I need to dig that down further, but I left it up there so you can see what I'm talking about. I have the nursery pot inside of a decorative pot, and I'll fill in around that with some soil. And as I was saying, one of the tricks to keeping these guys blooming is to keep them pot bound. I don't like looking at nursery pots. I don't think they're very attractive, and I'm sure a lot of people would agree with me on that. So I take their nursery pot and I sink it into a decorative pot, and then I'll fill in with dirt around there, and I still want the plant to be lower. And that's so I can really very heavily drench and soak the bird of paradise without having to drench my annuals as much, because I tend to usually put like portulaca or something in the front that doesn't need a ton of water. It's also useful to keep the plant buried a little bit lower so you can heavily soak it. These guys like a lot of water. Similar to banana trees, their columns, their entire structure is made up of water. So you want to go ahead and water them as often as you can, but you don't want them to stay constantly wet or else they will rot. They can dry out more during the winter months. So when you bring them inside, you don't have to water them as often. They don't need these heavy soakings, but they still need water. More importantly, this is one of the keys, one of the big keys to getting these guys to flower, is they need sun. They need lots and lots of sun. So you can grow them in part sun, anywhere from 3 to 6 hours. They're gonna flower for you much better in 4 hours or more. Even better, 6 to 8 hours is really the way to go if you're growing these in a pot and you want to get them to flower. That being said, anytime you have a potted plant in the sun, they need a lot of water. They need a lot of water anyways, but you just don't want them to dry out heavily and bake if you live someplace very warm. Also, you want to give them plenty of fertilizer. I would fertilize these guys weekly. Maybe alternate your weeks with a blooming fertilizer starting in late winter and early spring. I move mine outside earlier than I do my others because I have noticed that giving them a chill, not a freeze, but a chill, helps encourage their bloom spikes. So when I say these guys do better with a little bit of a chill for me, I usually bring them out when the nighttime temperatures are dropping between 45 and 50. However, you don't want to let them go any colder than that. I would not let them go below 45 or 40. In potted culture, you're not just going to be chilling the top of the plant, but the roots as well, because those are exposed. In the ground, they could probably handle below 40 for a brief period of time. Seeing as how I believe zone 9 is supposed to go, 20 to 30 degrees? Now, I looked up this chilling thing online. This is something I was told as a child by somebody at a nursery out in Seattle, and they said go ahead and let them have a few weeks where they're getting the nighttime cools, and that will encourage them to bloom, along with being pot bound and along with being fertilizer and getting lots and lots of sunlight. And that has always worked for me like a charm. It's worked wonderfully. But I got online because I wanted to find more information about this to share with everybody in this video. I can't really find anything on it, so it could potentially just be an old wives' tale, but it is working for me. And I went ahead and I have 2 separate examples here. You'll notice these 2 plants look different. The plant here on the right, full sun, full scorching sun. And I brought it outside in March because we had an exceptionally warm March. We had a week of cold where I moved it back in the house. But this got a chill. Over here, this guy has been getting part sun, probably 3.5 to maybe 4.5 hours a day of sun. And I did not bring it out until, I want to say, mid to late April, when the nighttime temperatures were already in the mid 50s and upper 60s. They were shifting around a lot. That's how things are where I live. But this plant is much more full, it's much more lush, and so aesthetically as a house plant, I prefer the plant on the left. But as far as the flowers go, plant on the right, full sun with the chill and the fertilizing, looks much better as far as the flowers go. Something to keep in mind when purchasing your bird of paradise is that it takes them anywhere from 3 to 4 years to start blooming. Because like I mentioned, they need to be larger and they like to be somewhat root bound. So if you're going to buy some of these from a nursery and they're teeny tiny little things, then be prepared. You're going to have to wait quite some time for them to flower. So not only do you want to buy them when they're fairly big, which does mean they'll probably be more expensive. I think I paid $40 for this plant a year or 2 years ago, and this one, it's a Monrovia, so it was $50, which is expensive, but you save the time from not having to wait for them to flower. So the flowers on these guys raise all the way up from inside the leaf nodes. This one down here came out from in between this leaf and this leaf, and they start out like a little nub, just like this guy. See how it's swelling in here? It's got this nub coming out. Then it progresses onto a spike, very similar to how a lot of orchids flower and spike, coming out here from this node, and eventually reaching up into that lovely flower. They'll pop open, make their flowers, and you can kind of see why they're called the bird of paradise, because they resemble sort of like a flying crane. The growth habit on the bird of paradise, every new branch comes out from the center. New leaf, I should say, comes out from the middle. In full sun, you're going to get shorter, very stiff leaves with smaller petals, whereas in the shade, like on the other one I showed you back there, longer, more petal-like, flatter foliage. And that's one of the great things that lets you know about their blooming, because we know that the new growth comes from the middle. So it's like a banana tree or a palm tree. If you see something growing out from up here in one of the nodes up high, that's probably going to be a bloom spike. Now, they are clustering plants, so it's entirely possible that you could have something like this come up but a little bit lower down near the soil, and it could be a new set of plants starting, because they just clump and keep on growing that way. And that's one of the things that's really cool about them, is within a few years these guys will get 5 to 6 feet tall. Typically I'd say 3 to 5 feet is more on the average. Keeping them in full sun will help keep them shorter for you. There are also a variety of different types of Strelitzia Reginae. There's the orange flowered, the gold flowered. There are some that have foliage that comes up looking more like a spike, where basically they just don't have leaves on them. So they have spears. That's not really a good depiction. But they look like really big, tall, thick grass blades as opposed to these big paddle-like, almost banana-like leaves. Another thing I like about these is they're also very similar to heliconias. Now, I do still prefer heliconias because they bloom profusely. They just bloom and bloom and bloom and bloom. They're not as finicky. There's not really an art to getting them to bloom you need to keep them healthy as you do with any plant. Healthy plants flower better. Bird of paradise, if you're growing them in a pot, there's usually a bit more of a fine touch that goes to it. Alright, so that'll do it for today's video. If you have any questions, feel free to message me. Any comments, you can help me out with anything, teach me something. I always appreciate that if anybody has any additional tips and tricks in addition to the pot bound, the cool temperatures, high sun, and a blooming fertilizer, and overall just keeping your plant healthy. Let me know what your tips and tricks are, how these plants have been growing for you. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. It makes a really big difference to me and the growth of my channel and my efforts. And I hope we can all keep on communicating and keep on growing together. And I'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.